right, so hello everyone. Welcome to our plenary event for the 2021 PRSA Symposium. My name is Karian Soto Vega and I'm assistant professor at University of Kentucky. My fields are writing, rhetoric, and digital studies, but of course, gender, women's studies, and Puerto Rican studies. So it is my pleasure to be here moderating this event that we are calling Critical Rican Race Studies. And it is a delight to have the set of speakers that we have with us today. And in the past, usually plenaries or keynotes are typically one person, but we love the fact that we have this set of amazing scholars to share their expertise with us tonight. It is going to be a question and answer type of event. And so I will just let each of you, if I just say your name, if you can introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work, and what are the stakes and discussions of race for Puerto Ricans today. So we'll start with Julie Torres.
I was about to take a sip of water. Okay, so hi everyone. First, I want to thank the PRSA board for organizing this event and inviting me to be a part of this conversation with scholars whom I respect. So it's nice to meet you all virtually. I am an assistant professor of women's and ethnic studies and the Latinx studies coordinator at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. And my work engages with issues of diaspora, transnationalism, activism. Just to tell you a little bit about my broader project, my work explores Puerto Rican women's activism in Orlando, Florida, centering the lives and narratives of Puerto Rican women around events that are typically conceived of in the public imagination as crisis. So when I first arrived to do my ethnographic fieldwork, and I'm coming from the discipline of anthropology, so this involved 2 years of participant observation and interviews. During that time, there were a lot of different things happening. The fiscal crisis, which was a catalyst for migration from Puerto Rico to Florida, the shooting at Pulse nightclub, Hurricane Maria, and the 2016 elections. And so my work coalesces around these events and uses these events as a starting point to examine crisis theoretically and ethnographically in looking to the ways that crisis is lived and the ways that it's embodied materially and emotionally. So those are the questions that I'm engaging with. And broadly speaking, we see crisis as theorized in terms of exception, right, and emergency. And my current book project attends to what I call the spaces in between, these messy spaces of messy encounters, of intersections and contradictions that complicate the binary between crisis and non-crisis. And in looking to the ways that the intersections of crisis and activism operate within diaspora framework. So just very quickly, what I find is that the public fixation on crisis does little more than conceal these longstanding inequalities like colonialism and iterations of second-class citizenship, right, that operate across borders. And yet in many ways, crisis is also generative as Puerto Ricans imagine and fight for a future that includes us. And in terms of what's at stake in these discussions and those of race that we're going to have today, it's quite literally existence in the future. And I'm interested in the ways that these experiences of oppression are shaped by the matrix of gender, ethnicity, race, sexuality, and class. And I think that social analysis necessitates this type of engagement. So I'll stop there.
Wonderful, thank you. And I should note that Julie Torres won the 2020 Virginia Sanchez Corral Dissertation Award. So congratulations again, and thanks for being back here with us. So now we're going to take it into discussion with Shanti Rosado. So the same, kind of introduce yourself and your work with race. Thanks.
Hey everyone, I'm Shanti Rosado. I am an assistant professor of Afro-Latinx Studies at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. And at New Brunswick at Rutgers, I am in Africana Studies and in Latino and Caribbean Studies, which was kind of like my dream job. So I'm happy that this is where I ended up and how I ended up in these departments. That said, I am trained as a sociologist, so I'm coming in very much as a social scientist, but very much critical of how social science approaches race and trying to take Black studies seriously in our interrogations of race and think about not just how we apply these categories and how we think about categories, but really complicating our understandings of how race is tied to notions of humanity. And so in my work, my current project is about Puerto Ricans and Dominicans in Central Florida. And in interviewing them, I'm really interested in how emotions are tied to racial ideology. So I see ideology as kind of the vehicle through which race moves from the interpersonal to the structural. And I'm looking at emotions as kind of a way to get around the stickiness of race and try and understand how it's very situated in the body, right? How those views kind of live in people's bodies and then get externalized. And also how they kind of get exchanged, right? How they're valued differently. So one of the things that I look at is anti-Blackness and what it looks like when Puerto Ricans and Dominicans talk about anti-Blackness, how they might espouse or challenge notions of anti-Blackness, and what that tells us about race in these spaces in the Caribbean, but also in a US context. And one of my big arguments, and this gets to your question about the stakes of talking about race, is that I don't think it's not a US phenomenon to think about anti-Blackness. I think we all here can agree on that. But I think it's important to know that the reason why anti-Blackness has so much currency for Puerto Ricans and Dominicans in the US is because of that similarity of anti-Blackness across the Americas, that kind of that consistency of anti-Blackness across region can lead to, I guess, alignments, right? Alignments that support and sustain white supremacy. So that's my current project. I'm also working on a book about Cardi B and specifically engaging with how people racialized her and police her Blackness in online spaces, as well as her political engagements. So that's, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And we already have someone in the chat saying Cardi B book, yes. Awesome. So thanks again. And shout out to Black Latina Snow Collective from Jessica Marie Johnson. Thank you. So thanks again. And so now we're going to shift into Cristina Gonzalez, and I'll let you introduce yourself and your work. Thanks.
All right. Thank you. I actually first want to start by saying that I'm a person who stutters. So you're going to see a lot of stuttering tonight from me. So that just means that I'm going to repeat, sounds and have like pauses and blocks and my speech, but the words will eventually come out. I am, and I also want to start by thanking Carrie Ann and the PRSA organizers, especially Shakti Castro for the invitation to be here and for the inclusion of Taino perspectives on the topic of race through my and Sharina's work. I also want to acknowledge the honor and privilege that it is to be here in such esteemed company. And I look forward to hearing what my co-panelists and colegas have to share on this topic and dialoguing here and beyond. I'm currently in the throes of dissertation writing, actually. I'm a doctoral candidate in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin. Also doing portfolios in Native American and indigenous studies and museum studies. And my work looks at Taino subject formation and ethnogenesis amongst Puerto Ricans in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Diasporically in New York City and the surrounding tri-state and Mid-Atlantic region, as well as transnationally between the diaspora and Puerto Rico, and also spatially over social media. So the idea of transit really characterizes my approach to this work and really reflects the how people and ideas and practices move in the resurgent world. There we go. It came out. I came about doing this work through my experiences in the transnational indigenous world, beginning with work at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, my work on urban indigeneity amongst Mapuche in Chile, and then primarily and profoundly with urban Maori in New Zealand. And I say profoundly because it was my experiences there being indigenized repeatedly by Maori in and outside of the academy that kind of spawned the questions that guide my dissertation. So asking, am I Taino? Can I be? What makes a person Taino? And then wanting to understand the conditions and politics behind that. So in terms of the stakes for Puerto Ricans in discussions of race, with regards to this topic, there are many. Just broadly, it gets us to reconsider the position of the Indian and Taino-ness as a subject to even claim in an embodied kind of way. And I'll add more to that also as we discuss, further. But I also think that, like, given the topic of discussion, it's also important to kind of, start in our own, bodies. So in my own body, and how I, acknowledging my own racial identity and positionality and privileges, and the anxieties around all of that, right? So I count myself as one of those Puerto Ricans who, like, would check the other box, and and the multiple racial categories in there, right? Like African American, American Indian, and also white. So and that acknowledges my own knowledge of my own family ancestries and the racial makeup of my own family. So even though I'm like Afro-descendiente and part of the African diaspora, I don't present as Black. So I, like, personally, I find it, it's it's not something that I claim out of respect for my family members and other Puerto Ricans, that's their lived experience, the good and the bad that comes along with that. And then at the same time, I'm also invested in questions of re-indigenization and what that means also in terms of race. I've just talked a lot, so I'm gonna be quiet right now.
Thank you. That's a great background. And so, we definitely have a good idea and of your grounding, right, of your work, but also your positionality. So thanks a lot. And I think that I was going to go with Ileana, but I think I'm going to go with Sharina Feliciano Santos, just because there's a better transition there. So yes, Sharina, please.
Hi, I'm Sharina Feliciano Santos, and I'm an associate professor of anthropology and linguistics at the University of South Carolina. And I'm going to enter a little bit sort of directly to the question of the stakes, and then through that talk a little bit about my research. And I think through my research and the questions that came up that I think Cristina and Shanti also and Julie sort of pointed to already to some extent, is that I really became interested in understanding how on a discursive and ideological level, ethno-racial categories and orders have been produced and experienced in Puerto Rico. I think that in looking at the production and experience of those racial orders, and those are going to look different for different Puerto Ricans who embody race in different kinds of ways. We can elucidate the tangled, complex, and contradictory ways that these different experiences on the ground, family stories, ways of being seen and seeing others can interrupt these totalizing national and colonial identity narratives that circulate within the island broadly. I think that through an analytical lens that looks at the production of these racial orders, we can address how the discursive limits and modes of interpreting ethno-racial identity and alterity, so ways were similar, but also ways that were different, can become produced, and how they are, these forms of identity and subjectivity become produced as debatable. So that kind of leads to the project. So I'm interested in really looking at, and I think this is the broader question that sort of my research experiences speak to, is what anchors different forms of identity for different people, and what are the forms of evidence or the sort of forms of visibility or invisibility that give people a right to narrate those anchors in different ways. I'm really interested in making sense of the historical and political formations and mechanisms that impact when, why, and under what conditions people make claims to identity, call out claims to identity, and put into question other people's claims of their lived experiences or not. So I'm interested in looking at how it works historically across contexts, how these racial orders that got produced through the consecutive colonizations of the island come to kind of in place particular perceptual or temporal limits to being a particular kind of group category. I'm interested in what counts as evidence for claims to an identity. So how do you make yourself visible in a context that has semiotically rendered you impossible? Or in a context where, you know, the possibilities for your identity have already been predefined based on ideas of inclusion and exclusion. I'm interested in what representations and expectations people's claims become measured against. So what are the things that people say you can't be this or you're not this because this is X, Y, or Z? And ultimately, I'm really interested in how power is at play in these different moments. So ultimately, I'm really interested in how colonial projects have built contemporary racial orders, how they can make, and how we can, as an intervention, make explicit how these racializing logics in Puerto Rico distribute privilege, marginalization, and erasure through alternating forms of cooptation, celebration, and trivialization through things like the racial triad. I think it's also important to show, and this is my ethnographic background, how people navigate and respond to the structural and discursive forms of power that attempt to narrate and delimit them in racial terms, but in Puerto Rico, we know that that plays out more broadly in terms of things like gender, or in terms of language, or in terms of your migration experience. In fact, it's my own experience migrating back to the island when I was 9 from Chicago, where people were like calling me La Americanita because I didn't speak Spanish, you know, in a nice way that people thought, you know, was cool. And, you know, I actually grew up in the same town as Garian, which is interesting. We found this out recently, that like I started to see that, you know, Puerto Ricanness as a project can be very exclusionary and very totalizing in specific kinds of ways. So for me, the ethnographic approach I took to my research in Puerto Rico really tried to highlight the different ways of knowing that grounded people's forms of self-knowing and social action, and really tried to highlight how at stake in a lot of these contestations that kind of are strewn within the Taino groups I did research with, but also, you know, within the island more generally, contestation and debate is a big part of how we belong to sort of the national discourse or not. But how ambiguity and ambivalence is at play and how people, you know, people who might have a particular form of education or not, people who have different kinds of experiences, being rural or from the city, being from área metro or being del campo, how ambiguities and ambivalences come into play and how people interpret the historical record, their forms of communication, and the stories people relied on to moor their ancestry as an important part of their contemporary identity. In a broader discursive and ideological context that doesn't always acknowledge or recognize that identity. So for me, it was important to see how these ambiguities and ambivalences are themselves the product of colonial processes involved in producing social orders, as well as how they were rendered interpretable through the modes of seeing and knowing that sometimes were rooted in these very distinctive, though sometimes overlapping, other times contradictory epistemological grounds. So just to close, my own travails through knowing and unknowing in the context of this project, as someone who entered with skepticism regarding sort of the Taino revival in 2004 when I first read about it, it required me to kind of accept that I only could know the island in these limited ways, and that there were the other ways that people were knowing the island. So this itself became an analytical framework through which to see the importance that there might be an unfixed and unsettling ways of seeing and interpreting that exist on the island that have been disciplined in specific ways through things like school books, through the educational experience, through interactional claims that people make about, oh, you're not this, you're that, because I can see it in this thing, or this thing about you tells me that you have this. You know, how do we unfix and unsettle those modes of seeing and interpreting, and listen to the stories that people tell about their lives in terms of how they try to interrupt these totalizing racial narratives that in the end do rely, as Shanti said, on anti-Blackness and indigenous erasure in these specific ways that kind of like Shanti pointed to, you know, we often think about as happening in the US, but it became interested to think about, you know, those colonial orders got produced in the island as well. How did they play out in Puerto Rico? And how can we create new accountabilities for Puerto Ricans who have articulated themselves through the racial triad as not accountable to the colonial harms that have been produced in the island, right? So those are sort of some of the things that I think are at stake, and I think become very important now in the context of these ongoing processes of colonization in Puerto Rico.
Thanks so much. And I think that also kind of provides a transition to Ileana Rodriguez Silva and your work. So if you could provide a bit of an introduction to your work and some thoughts on what's at stake in studying race in Puerto Rico.
Well, thank you so much. It feels like such a huge task to follow all these wonderful scholars before me. So I will try to measure to your standards. So thank you very much for everybody for the invitation. For those who are here, participants, I'm Ileana Maria Rodriguez Silva. I'm associate professor in the history department at the University of Washington in Seattle. And here in Seattle, I'm currently living as an uninvited guest to the Coast Salish peoples in the lands and waters that they are the stewards of. I was trained as a 19th century historian of slavery, of colonialism, and in particular of dynamics of emancipation. And that was my entry point, actually, to study race making, racial meaning, and identity formation in the Caribbean, but most importantly to me, on Puerto Rico. So my first book, my research project began by asking very simple questions, which is what happened to former slaves? What kind of lives were they able to build? How did they themselves shape the process of emancipation? How did emancipation impact the racial economy, the racial politics, and race relations in Puerto Rico? And there was such a glaring, absence of scholarship. There was such an absence in the archives. I arrived to the archives and I found 3 boxes, in this place that was like thousands and thousands of boxes. But was probably more dramatic for me was how much my research was undermined, how much people made fun of me, how much I was discouraged, and how much anger was thrown at me as I was doing that research. And it was in that process that I started thinking that the silencing that I was sort of seeing in the archives and in the scholarship was something much bigger, more dramatic, more complex and longstanding. So that's how I ended up sort of trying to think through the silencing of race, and also what are some of the other languages in which people were trying to address issues of social justice. And at that moment, what emerged for me was a language of work and a language of class that displays, the work of anti-racism. And that was actually one of the venues in which people were trying to do that work without necessarily explicitly calling it, this is race work. So that's what I did in that project. And originally the project actually was titled The Conspiracy of Silence. But I was pushed to change that name so much that I ended up then talking about silencing. But in reality, it was, to me, the way I felt it and studied it and thought about it, is this was a conspiracy. It was too many things at play. This was not just basic negligence, this was intentional. So at the moment, I'm working on a different project. I actually have 2 different projects, but the one that is more directly related to the work that I'm doing today is, it's actually very much connected also to this first book. And it's trying to reconstruct the network of Puerto Rican Black activists politicians, intellectuals, and artists that were doing anti-racist work in the 1910s and 1920s. I am particularly interested with that story to unearth this racialized Black cosmopolitan history of Puerto Rican struggles for civil rights in early 20th century. So I'm trying to, the work I'm doing is trying to find out how these Black bodies ended up doing this amazing work for Puerto Ricans regarding freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom against state policing, journalism, how can we rethink a way of doing agriculture, what kind of businesses we're able to do. So that's what I'm interested on, and I am trying to focus on doing that work in the southeast part of the country. So I'm focusing on Ponce, Juana Diaz, Guayama, Villalba, Santa Isabel, which is pretty much the focus of this work. Although it is from this area then that a larger network is being sort of, put in motion with people then who are living in the United States and are constantly in conversation. And this is all work that is being done in the 1910s and 1920s. So that's where I am. And that's what is at stake for me. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that, isn't it? It's this racialized history of civil rights work that we tend to forget, that it is very specific about this, how these bodies experience everyday life, that the civil rights in particular took hold and were fought around.
Thank you. That definitely is sort of resonant with the title that we chose for this session. And so I think that if you all are up for it, and I shared the questions with you all, so I think hopefully you've had some thoughts on, the way that we came up with this title as a somewhat kind of tongue-in-cheek manner, alluding to the current panic over CRT, critical race theory in US schools, to kind of continue in conspiracy to silence these histories. And so we wondered what might a discussion about what a critical Rican race theory could be. Of course, we have several different kinds of emphases here in your research and your work and disciplinary orientations, but just generally, thinking, what would you consider to be critical Rican race theory? And I'm just gonna let you all kind of take it as you please. So whoever wants to jump in first.
I think for me, I was thinking about this and sort of thinking through being in a university in the South where I am feeling sort of pressures toward particular forms of monitoring and surveillance for teaching on issues related to race, especially with more recent research I've been doing on policing in the South. And as I've been thinking through these projects in tandem and the issues sort of anti-Blackness and Indigenous erasure in the US and of anti-Blackness and Indigenous erasure in Puerto Rico, and how those kind of played out through different experiences of colonialism and colonial empowerment. An issue that kind of played out through all of that is this question of accountability. I think that, one thing that CRT is sort of doing is it's like a gaslighting of accountability, right? Like of who is accountable to who for harm. And these anti-CRT movements are really moving away from dealing with white accountabilities for harm. And I was thinking about this in the context of Puerto Rico, where so often in the context of friends and family making claims to experiences of discrimination, racism, prejudice, marginalization on and then through different kinds of mechanisms that happen on the ground in Puerto Rico, one of the ways that harm has been sort of not made accountable for is through these claims of, well, I'm all of these things too, like, bringing out an ancestor in specific kinds of ways. And I think a critical race studies, if we're going to play with this idea of CRT and what is going on, is like, how, as Puerto Ricans, do we come to rethink and become accountable to our ancestries, and how it's not going to look the same for everyone? Because the national project, and it's all these wonderful researchers and people, in our audience, but who are also thinkers on these issues, have shown so much of the national project has been built in a way that has erased historical memory, that has sort of built this sense of commonality on a cultural level to account for the forms of economic extraction that would come in through US imperial sort of designs. How do we, as Puerto Ricans, create a conversation around accountabilities and different and this is going to play out in two ways that I think Cristina sort of has pointed to, is on the one hand, there's a difference for who lives the experience on the ground, right? And the way that sort of the racial orders in Puerto Rico played out differently, right? So that it hyper-visibilized and externalized Black Puerto Ricans in very specific ways. And this played out different, and it erased the possibility of seeing indigeneity, right? Like, it made it like not, there's like no anchor for it in the national discourse, even though it was celebrated on a sort of broad, sort of general level as everyone's sort of heritage. But I think there needs to be a rethinking of these relationships between ancestry, heritage, and sort of lived identity that are going to be complicated and entangled, right? But at the same time, might lead to a conversation around accountabilities for harm, accountabilities for oppression. And so I'll leave it there. But for me, that's like one way in which I kind of see these, that play kind of potentially be generative for thinking about what could come out of a critical approach to thinking about race in Puerto Rico.
I can jump in because I see some common threads with how I was thinking about this question and Sharina's comments. And I'll begin by sharing a short anecdote that this conversation I had with one of my interlocutors who identifies as Afro-Boricua. And she spoke about her own invisibility within activist circles, particularly recalling one instance at a meeting with other Puerto Rican and Latinx leaders around conversations around Black Lives Matter, right? And she was trying to organize around these issues and to join the movement, have Puerto Ricans in Florida to go out and try to organize around these events. And instead of, what she was hoping would happen, which was participation, she was met with other activists, saying, well, they're in solidarity. And it reminded me, of first time during the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020, when I saw the signs and the social media posts that read Latinos for Black Lives. The implication being that Blackness and Latinidad are mutually exclusive, when we all know that that's simply not true. So we need to have, critical conversations about how anti-Black racism and white supremacy are prevalent, in our own families, our communities, and the systems and institutions that surround us. And I teach a lot of intro-level courses on social justice. One of the biggest challenges is getting people to talk about white privilege, right? It makes them uncomfortable. They deflect because it doesn't pertain to them personally, or in many cases, as I observed, during my field work, to the racial politics of the archipelago, right? These discourses of mestizaje that run deep and facilitate, the erasure of Blackness and indigeneity that Sharina was just talking about. So if we were to imagine a critical race studies, there would need to be a reckoning with that and with our own histories of slavery, of housing segregation, policing, and all the other ways that Black Puerto Ricans continue to be systematically oppressed, and the ways that whiteness leads to material and ideological benefits, both in Puerto Rico and in the US. And, the scholars of the Black Latinas No Collective, I know there's already been shout outs, but I'm also like a big fan, and others on this panel have brought attention to all of this. So I won't go on this point, but I think it's important to recognize and cite their work, because as scholars, we run the risk of reproducing these same hierarchies. So all of this is to say that I think that critical Rican race theory would embrace the principles that are inherent, principles of social justice inherent in CRT, both within and beyond the legal component, but where Puerto Rican studies can really expand CRT is in bringing this colonial, neo-colonial analysis, as well as a transnational analysis of anti-Black racism and how it functions across the Atlantic. And again, this needs to be intersectional because Black feminist scholars, have taught us that we can engage in an analysis of racism without also considering how it's compounded by class, sexuality, and gender, and et cetera.
That was amazing. Everything that has been said on this question has been amazing. So thank you to Sharina and to Julie. I guess one thing that I'll add is that Eliana brought up the importance of recuperating Black histories, and I think that's really critical to whatever it is that we're conceptualizing as critical Rican race studies, because of that conspiracy of silence that she mentions. It's really hard to even discuss what race means if you don't even know what the lived experience was of people who were enslaved in Puerto Rico, for example. And so that process of recuperating memories, which at this point can only really go so far, right? Like we can only go so far back, and that's something that we can talk about too. What does it mean to imagine what that was? It's going to be a process, because I find that, in trying to recuperate my own memories as a Black Puerto Rican, I constantly encounter, what some colleagues have called Latinx fragility, right? Which is a corollary to white fragility. So folks don't like Black memories. Folks don't want them to exist, and because they are inconvenient, right, to both the nationalist project of Puerto Rico, the anti-colonial project in Puerto Rico, right? There's something invested in keeping us united at all costs, right? And that is ultimately detrimental to Black Puerto Ricans. And so I guess the question for me is like, can Puerto Rican studies even survive in actual critical Rican race studies? Or would it be displaced? Will that nationalist project be displaced by more attention to the African diaspora, more attention to how the Americas as a whole, right? So what happens when we don't think within those confines of Puerto Rico, or through that lens? So I'll just leave that there.
I have a few thoughts. I came to the question maybe a slightly bit different. I had a really hard time trying to think about CRT. Maybe it's because I have been so well disciplined into my discipline of history. And by this I mean when I came into graduate school in the early 90s, it was the moment in which CRT was actually emerging as its own crystallized institutional space, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison was one of those places in which there was a very, active critical race theory group, but it was also a collective that it was very much well-defined as a legal studies. And it was also very much defined by a particular articulation of inequalities as a post-civil rights structures in the US. So when as a historian of Latin America and the Caribbean, I came to inhabit those spaces, I found myself as a young, just beginning, like trying to understand. I remember being sitting in that table and actually said, why is this new to you? Like it's like Puerto Ricans are experts at this. Like we invented this in the 19th century and onwards. We have perfected it. You know, we can talk about, you know, earlier forms of multiculturalism, earlier forms of colorblindness. And in many ways, what that did to me is that Puerto Rican critical race theory could be one important side to sort of trouble the origin points that those particular moments, you know, that particular collective was using to ask these questions. One of them was, let's start thinking about empire. We were not thinking about empire. That's not what CRT was doing in the 1990s, no? This is something that we need to do, and this is actually when we need to dislodge it, no? So there is something about the ways in which the Puerto Rican case and us as Puerto Rican theories of race can actually bring to this field, is to remind us, there's other chronologies to these stories. There is other points of origins. It's not the same to think about multiculturalism and color blindness as emerging from the colonial state as to start thinking what happens when it comes from a very side, you know, that is actually anti-colonial. What do we do with that? And it still is equally problematic, but it has a different origin. So I think that in many ways, not only Puerto Rico, but the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, as we start thinking about this history, it forces us to think broader or more broadly, but also to complicate these power dynamics that are at place between one here and the other, and actually see many other peoples invested, no? And it's why it has given so much life to these problems of erasures and silencings that we see today.
When I saw the, you know, question, it just brought me back to unpacking La Gran Mezcla as the orientating paradigm of Puerto Ricans, and how that influences how we see ourselves racially, right? With the kind of you know, that essential, you know, hybridity at the core of the souls of Puerto Rican folks, and it being a tripartite model of Black, white, and red, and then also thinking about who's left out of that, what racial subjectivities among Puerto Rican society are also erased from that. So thinking about Chinese, Puerto Ricans, Middle Easterns, or, you know, those of Middle Eastern you know, descent, and what it means to include or exclude them from that kind of what like Charles Hale and Peter Wade talk about as the mestizaje, you know, from above, and looking at mestizaje from below, which in my work, I found that it's really, you know, these you know, some silenced, you know, some subaltern, contestable, and you know, histories, ancestries, and you know, racialized experiences that are privileged, and also like a matrix of hyper descent over hyper, descent, which is I forgot where I was going to go with that. Sorry. But I will add that critical question that emerged for me in relationship to CRRT and the acknowledgement of differently racialized subjectivities in Puerto Rican society and the experiences of racism and discrimination that accompany that is whether is whether we leave behind and whether there's a kind of opening for like if we're entering a multicultural moment where which has happened in other parts of Latin America, and what that would mean on the policy level of acknowledging the racial differences amongst Puerto Ricans and working to be accountable to how peoples are discriminated against differently.
That's wonderful. Thank you. So we have a series of questions that I was going to post just generally for anyone. And if you haven't had a chance to look at the chat, people are snapping and clapping and and extending further all of your wonderful thoughts here. But I think that one of the questions that was asked in the Q&A here would be a good transition. So Marisol Lebron asks, and she says, thank you so much for this incredible panel and for sharing your amazing work. I was wondering if the panelists can talk a bit about methodology given the conspiracy of silence around discussing race in Puerto Rico and the diaspora. What thoughts do you have for scholars, especially early career scholars who want to do this work? So methodology to kind of undo this conspiracy of silence. I think, you all talked about policy just right now. Cristina was mentioning that, right? Accountability is up there as well. Continuing to rehistoricize this attention to the dangers of or the perpetuating of multiculturalism or color blindness, right? So I think that there's a bit of a toolbox developing, but in terms of kind of, thinking through the potential of a methodology to teach this, because a lot of you also mentioned teaching, so thoughts?
Can I just jump at this very briefly with something that I know is supposed to be like a dada, but I should put it out there. First is collaboration. When I began this work 20, almost 30 years ago, it was such little few people that were willing to even do this work, to think about it, to talk about it. So to have now this crowd of magnificent, powerful scholars with this magnificent, digital skills to be able to do the kinds of conversations, but also to do some of the crowdsourcing that we need to do. Let's subvert the digital and neoliberal sense of crowdsourcing to do the work that we need to do. So that should be part of that methodology that we need in order to be able to push out there. So if you find, people and names of the 1910s and the 1920s that you think I should put in my list, give it to me, because then I will jump in and continue the work that I'm trying to do.
And as you all formulate your thoughts, that also, I think, gets at Marinubia Feliciano's question. Do you think it is generational, the understanding of racial identity within the PR community? And I think definitely within this scholarly group, but yeah, if you want to kind of combine those two.
I can speak a little bit to that last question. I would say there's definitely a generational rift, rift in terms of understandings of race, and that may just have to, do with lived experiences, right? Like, we're not in a moment right now where we have to kind of scream and say, like, Latinos are here, we exist, we we're beyond that point. And so I feel like now that we're kind of getting into these conversations, critical conversations about race, about difference, there is a lot of pushback, I think. And I don't know if others have experienced similar things, but there's a pushback when we present our work. And when we talk, just the naming of race is radical to some people, the naming of race in Puerto Rico, or at least in the ways that we do so. And so I think it is, I definitely see some generational differences, but I don't think that those are universal at all. And there are plenty of people from all generations that are on the same page when it comes to these issues. In terms of methodology, I would say that it's very important to trust your lived and embodied knowledge when it comes to this sort of work, because I feel like one of the reasons why I got into this work myself is because what I was seeing in the literature was not matching what I lived and saw in my everyday life. And a lot of it was, US scholars, white US scholars or Black US scholars saying they either hate themselves and they don't acknowledge that they're Black, or they are changing how race operates in the US. And I'm like, how is the importation or the migration of anti-Black people into the US challenging the US racial order? I don't see it. So I feel like that methodological approach has to be, has to incorporate the lived experience and has to be honest about our lived experiences, even if those are cringy as hell, right? Like, we have problematic people in our families, anti-Black people in our families, people who aspire to whiteness in our families. We got all that. So instead of trying to like paper over that and say, here's what Puerto Ricans do, like, get into it, address the issue, head on. That's what I'm hoping to see in the future.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I do a lot of hanging out. And I find that that's the best way. Often, like, the most insight I gain is when the tape recorder is off. So that lived experience component is really important and central methodologically. One thing that I did when I was starting my project, just kind of as just an exercise, a little experiment, is I did print out the census question. And I gave it to a lot of, the people that were participants in my study, people who I was, encountering in the field. And I had them, fill it out. And oftentimes that solicited a lot of conversation around racial identity, right? And it took them a very long time to even just fill out that question. And those little side conversations and things that happened, when the tape recorder was off, was often the most important and insightful methodologically in my own project.
And if I may, I think that bringing the census question as a heuristic exercise, I mean, if you're thinking about teaching, that sounds like a very fun exercise and probably very generative. But does anyone else want to jump into these questions?
I was just going to add to, I mean, I think I'm so happy to be included in this conversation because I think everyone has had such important insights. And I think I'm going to kind of just add one of the things that I think Cristina and Shanti especially mentioned earlier in terms of reflecting on that lived experience is going to look different for different, and people are very attentive. As an anthropologist, people were very attentive to me being reflective about my own experience, and people knew what things meant, right? Like people know, because I mean, for those of us who have experienced Puerto Ricanness in terms of that, people are constantly, at least as I've experienced it, kind of like positioning you and figuring you out and knowing where to position you racially, where to position you classfully, where to position you, what town you're from, like all of these things are playing out. So I think it requires a lot of honesty and reflection for what your experiences have been and the limits of being able to have the same experience as someone else, because you won't necessarily in bridging these conversations get people to talk to you if they can't trust you. So building trust also knows the limits of what you can share. Not everything everyone shares with you regarding their experiences. It can inform how you think about things, but it doesn't necessarily need to go into, because there is a lot of trauma around these particular experiences that people maybe don't want to be re-traumatized by reading elsewhere. But it can inform, I think it can be informative to how you say things. And for me, as someone, I had to be honest with the groups that I worked with and gaining trust about how I came to the project. As someone who is learning and willing to listen, but who also did not have these experiences growing up and who entered kind of skeptically. And I was very honest with people and they understood that and were happy over time. And it took time to build trust. I remember one time I had an American grad student friend come in and everyone was like so friendly to her. Like it was so clear to me that they were like opening up to her and like, because she's outside of all of this drama, and me being from the island, I wasn't. But ultimately over time that trust was built in different kinds of ways. And for me, it also was really listening to what people are telling you when they're telling you things that maybe aren't about race immediately, but ultimately do become part of the stories, in my case, of how people experience notions of historical memory, erasure, and only being legible through these broader narratives and their own frustrations with that. So for me, that became like, it was a lot of self-reflection and self-awareness that also had to come in with respect to different kinds of privileges or not, where there was overlap or not in that particular context.
I just wanted to add from my experience being informed and trained in decolonizing methodologies and approaches to research, especially in a Maori context, and they take that real serious, very seriously, as they should. And it's an approach to research with humans, especially those who have who have been in our minoritized and oppressed in different ways. And speaking to what Shanti mentioned earlier, like about seeing gaps in the literature and what was being said about Taino, versus what I experienced on the ground with Taino folks that I know, that I was coming in contact with. I noticed a huge disparity, and we have to think about research as a tool to silence and press. Like a lot of the literature that I engaged with was pathologizing Taino, and that causes harm. So it's about subverting these these ways of conducting work that silences. Sorry, that's my dog. I guess he agrees with me. But to doing work that is empowering, to like approaching communities who have been harmed by research and literature in ways that allow you to use the research that you're doing in empowering ways. Sorry.
Yeah, that sounds like a great goal. I think I think that when you were talking about policy, especially before, I'm trying to think about that as a potential sort of avenue again, to do that kind of empowerment. So I think at this point, we have a few other questions that are coming up. And so I'm going to ask one that was in the chat previously from Anne McPherson. Could Ileana say more about early 20th century Puerto Rican civil rights activists? Were these the same people who were prioritizing a discourse of labor in some venues while unsilencing race in their civil rights work? Or are they different people? I guess it's kind of making the bridge between the two.
Yes, I don't want to take this, a space by the specificities of my own project, but at the moment I am looking at different people, not necessarily labor activists in the Socialist Party, actually people outside and in actually fighting with socialists at this moment. So, but at another moment we can deal with the particularities of my project. Thank you for the question, Anne.
Awesome. So then we have another question from Yumaira Figueroa Vasquez, and it's a question about Blackness and indigeneity. So it kind of brings us back to that conversation. Indigeneity, Afro-indigeneity. Much of the Taino and Neo-Taino movements have been deeply entangled with anti-Black sentiments, especially in the diaspora. How do we contend with these attitudes? Do you see the contemporary moves toward body indigenizing, grappling with this, or challenging anti-Blackness? And someone else had a similar question, so I figured I would ask it.
I can start a little bit. I know that Christina, her research has focused much more centrally on Afro-indigeneity, to my knowledge, than I do. So I know the limits of, I want to acknowledge the limits and in my own answers. So this has been a question that I grappled with, because when I started this project, the readings that I found had really positioned Taino indigeneity as a sort of mode of anti-Blackness. So that was kind of there at the outset, and something that I sort of was interested in seeing and how it would play out in terms of my own research. Now, doing ethnographic research, what you see also is what people allow you to see. And in the context of doing my research and spending time with people, in terms of anti-Blackness, not on the discursive level, but on the interactional level, what I saw were people really interacting with each other. I think there are modes in which people might have representationally done things like straighten their hair to represent indigeneity, but it was hard for me to point to whether that was emerging out of anti-Blackness that had been internalized in specific ways, or if it was a product of things like fitting a representational expectation of what indigenous uptake would look like. So people were grappling with these particular kinds of issues. in the context of my of my working with a lot of Taino people in that context, I experienced people really grappling with the sense that they had different ancestries, but what that could look like still within the context of knowing that they were indigenous, and that was the sort of cultural context in which they grew up, even though racially they might have these different kinds of racial ancestries. So people were grappling with those issues, but it was messy, and it wasn't necessarily like a straightforward answer, but something that people thought through in my interviews with them. Toward the end of my research, not toward the end of my research, while she was still living, one of the key collaborators in my research passed away last year. When I talked to her again in a sort of Smithsonian symposium that Cristina was key in organizing, one of the things that she said to me, she was saying to me, she's like, you know, I am sort of rethinking how I think about indigeneity. She had gone to Dominica to interact with Kalinago, and she was looking at the forms of Afro-indigeneity and sort of played out in that particular context, and sort of thinking about her own ancestries and her own political action. But you know, I wasn't able to sort of follow through because shortly thereafter she passed. So on that extent, you know, there are ways in which, and I think this is true in the US context, sometimes these different sentiments get entangled too as people try to make themselves visible to a specific kind of understanding of what indigeneity should look like or Blackness should look like in this sort of broader discourse. Now, on the other hand, on a more discursive level, I think what people did take issue with and weren't always great at, you know, I didn't quite always capture until thinking through some of the things that they were telling me later, is an assumption that they had that there was no possibility of Taino-ness. So any claim to Taino-ness was necessarily an erasure of other ancestries, and therefore, in that way, potentially anti-Black. So I think people did take issue with the possibility that their own family stories, their own narratives were so impossible that category couldn't exist, that therefore it had to be something else that was happening. So people did sort of speak to that particular issue a little bit. So they're like, it's not that I don't have this ancestry, it's that I'm also indigenous. And I have that particular kind of cultural background within the island, that ancestry within the island, and I practice these practices. So why can't I claim that too? So that kind of became the way in which people navigated these questions. Ultimately, in analyzing it, one way that I tried to think through is how, and I think this comes out in what I was saying earlier, is how have these kinds of contestations, these kinds of positionings, these kinds of relationalities between these differently oppressed populations come about through these kinds of colonial racial orders. And in that sense, the work of scholars such as Shauna Jackson were really helpful in really thinking about how settler colonialism and enslavement in Puerto Rico set up, in Puerto Rico, no, in her context, in like Guyana, Suriname sort of areas, set up a situation where it was a replacement kind of strategy. Once one can't exist, then it has to be the other. So even though the racial triad celebrates these three ancestries, in terms of the politics of indigenous genocide and erasure on a discursive level too on the island, it kind of set up the sense it's one or the other. And you know, how then does this produce a context wherein people making themselves legible, sort of it can be understood as engaging in these different modes of anti-Blackness. So I know it's not an answer, it's just like how I'm thinking through these things, and it's an ongoing thinking. I can't speak as much to the groups in the US because I largely was working with the groups in Puerto Rico. And the groups in the US that I did work with were more sort of interviews, rather than long-term field work. But in terms of the groups I worked with in Puerto Rico, I think people were very much still thinking in terms of a contestation of the racial triad. and the kinds of oppression they've experienced from that perspective. And that, to me, even in talking to people, the major critiques that they had was of españoles. I mean, people were still talking in some groups about españoles, and talking about los españoles en San Juan, los españoles en el pueblo de los towns that they lived in. And that, to me, was the main group that they were taking issue with within the island sort of politics. So still these like white Spanish elites that they saw as being empowered within the island and who they could not get accountability from in terms of their own experiences of poverty and marginalization. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's how I've tried to make sense of these tensions within what I saw during my field work.
Thank you, Christina. Do you want to respond too?
Yeah, I'll just add the one of the kind of gaps that I noticed in between the literature that I was speaking about earlier and or that I mentioned earlier, and what I was experiencing and witnessing on the ground with Taino peoples, it related to the question of anti-Blackness. So a lot of the some of the literature on contemporary Taino identities, one of the main arguments is that this is an anti Black movement, and that peoples who identify as Taino are really in denial of being Black and using the Indian to approximate whiteness. And what I was actually hearing discursively and also seeing ethnographically is actually a migration away from whiteness, not towards it. I can't think of anyone who laid claim to that in their conception of themselves as, in terms of their, conception of themselves. If anything, it was a denial of their white, ancestors, and like feeling, visceral shame, because the association is with this kind of archetype that the white ancestors represent the colonizers, and instead a kind of migration towards relating to Indianness and or Indian and come on, Blackness. And so for me, it was about the sort of data that I have does not support the argument that I son de terre, I can't speaking of French, but the reason of being is anti Blackness, and actually in that argument it completely omits the possibilities of Black and Indian subjectivity activities, which is something I encountered a lot, like especially in New York, a lot of Afro-Taino, Afro-Indigenous, Black Taino, like there are different terminologies that people prefer, connected a lot also with Black Native peoples in the US, the Shinnecock of Long Island, the Ramapo of New Jersey, and saw themselves, their experiences of having indigenous ancestries, indigenous and Black ancestries, cultures, and experiences though of being interpolated as Black. So the kind of politics of inclusion, inclusion and exclusion there. With that said, I will say that where I found the argument of anti-Blackness important is, where is there not anti-Blackness? Honestly, like it affects Puerto Ricans. Why would that not seep into the Taino world also, right? So I look at it more in terms of the politics of inclusion and exclusion, in what context. And I found that often mapping out in terms of how people talked about religion, and so it's not just racializing the corporal body, but racializing epistemologies, bodies of knowledge. So I can kind of go on, but I feel like I see there's like 5 minutes left and I feel bad. I'm just like, keep talking. But I think that's an important intersection that isn't talked about enough, is race and religion. And I engage that in my work.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to respond before I move on? Okay, so the last question that we have, kind of as a wrap up, to close out with a question about, we've learned a lot in this hour and a half already, but just the state of the field in general, what are recent shifts you can see in the field of Puerto Rican studies, and some new directions you would like to see emerge? I know that Cristina just mentioned, right, an attention to race and religion. So that, and I'm thinking of someone who does that kind of work, but yeah, so any other kinds of shifts, directions that you want to see within Puerto Rican studies at this point? Whoever wants to go first.
I think I will jump in this for a second, and I would like to see more historical work. I feel like the discipline of history has fallen on the side. And by this, I mean, not to have a historical perspective that allows you to put 2 paragraphs in background, talking about deep historical work that can do the work that we want to do in terms of race, even though we don't have to necessarily name it that way. We need to do works on the environment. We have to do more work on medicine. We have to do more work on militarisms, we need to do more historical work of sets. And we need to do more historical work on the legal work, something that detaches from the story of constant citizenship in the Jones and the Insular. All of that is magnificent and is very important, but we have an enormous legal apparatus. We still haven't done the work of law firms and the ways in which they were instrumental to be able to, manage the dispossessions of Puerto Rico for already 100 years. So, and that's a race history that we need to do. So I would love to see a little bit more of that.
Great. Shanti, you were gonna, yeah.
Yeah. So I think we're already part of one of the shifts, right? Like everyone here is already part of a very big shift, which is the shift away or the shift towards critically examining nationalism and the hegemony of mestizaje across Latin America and in the US too. So I feel like that's I'm very excited to be a part of that shift. It's an honor. One of the things that I would like to see more is more interdisciplinary engagements with Puerto Rican studies. I think also about how different regional lenses can factor into that. So for example, I talked online with someone about this recently, but what would it look like to think about Puerto Rico from a Latin American studies perspective versus a Latinx studies perspective versus a Caribbean studies perspective versus an Africana studies perspective? Like, I feel like that would be like an amazing book. So if y'all want to collaborate on that book, I'm down. So my questions for those would be like, what do each of these lenses allow us to see about Puerto Rico? Which conversations are open by each perspective and which conversations are closed off by each? Because I think that happens as well. And yeah, definitely more engagement with Black memories in all their forms is something that I'm heavily invested in, for sure.
I'm totally down for that type of book. But also, like, to add to that, right, like the sites of the diaspora are changing. And there's new and emergent scholarship, like places like Florida, where I did my research, Texas, and that can also allow us to rethink, these theoretical and empirical works, right, and generate these new questions and do that kind of relational work that you were talking about. But I've also definitely observed a shift towards more public-facing scholarship, and I think that that's an important and a necessary shift in thinking about how we can bring our scholarship outside of our institutions, right? Because there's everyday applicability to all of our work, which makes accountability that much more important. And the field of Puerto Rican studies is already so diverse in terms of our disciplines, our methods. So it's always exciting to kind of see these different innovative approaches that push the boundaries of our disciplines, right? And can allow for that kind of interdisciplinary conversation. In terms of the future, Ileana mentioned earlier, like more collaboration. And I think that more can definitely be done in terms of bridging scholarship coming outside of the archipelago with the diaspora. And I think about this in terms of activism, right, that's occurring in the diaspora in Puerto Rico every day. And then just given the radical history of Puerto Rican studies. So these are kind of important cross conversations that can be had, opening up this channels for dialogue, for collaboration, for engagement with each other's work. So I'm hopeful that can happen in the future as well.
Thank you. Sharina or Christina, do you want to?
Sure. I mean, I've learned so much in this conversation and the sort of space we've built. And I think as a method, this too is a method, right? Where we can speak about these things as a conversation in debate, but also with the vulnerabilities and, reflexivity of talking about race, which is such a lived and charged subject, and one that, requires a lot of vulnerability and to some extent, grace for oneself in exploring it and having these conversations. I think this points to Shanti's point earlier on of, sometimes you're talking to family members and they hold these deeply unsettling perspectives. And sometimes, you have it in yourself too, and you have to kind of be able to have a different kind of discourse around that. I would, at least for me, I would think. So, even looking at the comments, I do want to apologize for that idea that, Puerto Ricans know how to place you. I see like, and having these kinds of conversations of acknowledging accountability and, in my broader work, really thinking about these kinds of erasures don't just happen for Indigenous people claiming indigeneity in specific ways who can't be seen, but also for many Black Puerto Ricans who get seen as not part of the Boricua or the Puerto Rican project, right? Who become put to the side as from elsewhere in specific ways, even if visible interactionally. So I think, these kinds of moments of having these conversations and opening them up in ways where we can kind of think through these different experiences and to see what these different experiences, I think speaking to Shanti's project regarding how it works, these different kinds of ideas of race in Puerto Rico work to position people in ways that disempower. And speaking to Ileana's point, don't always happen just from the top, but happen amongst ourselves in our interactions. And as someone who studies interaction in anthropology, it does happen in interaction as people kind of position you or reposition you or silence you or take you seriously or not. So I think having these kinds of spaces and these kinds of conversations where people can share in these experiences is, I think, a shift in itself. So I just want to say I'm very grateful to the creation of the space for this conversation, for which I was extremely nervous because I'm aware of like the way that people position, taking on this project. When Ileana was talking about people kind of pushing back, and I know it's for different kinds of reasons, I've been nervous to talk about my research in these public venues and have pushed myself because I'm accountable to you all and this audience in this conversation. So I'm grateful to have a space in which to do it and to grow in my thinking alongside all of these beautiful minds that have opened up. So I think this is in itself a new direction. It's not just, I think, the topic, but the approach to thinking and collaborating that I've seen emerge in other venues and in a really beautiful way. And I'm grateful to have been included in this iteration of that here. So, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Christina. You want to close us off?
Oh no, that's a huge responsibility. After that, I thought that I'm sure his response was spot on. I was just gonna add that I'd like to see institutional support for research that's done on the margins of Puerto Rican studies, and that it's placed more in the center. So like even with regards to like what we attend to, like I when I was doing my field work in New York, I would go to the premier research and archival center for Puerto for Puerto Rican studies in the diaspora El Centro, and not find anything in the archives related to my work or to what I was like there was no attention at all to indigeneity among Puerto Ricans in the diaspora, which was odd to me, being that it's a movement that's been around since the 1980s. So like these silences in our institutional archives are really problematic for those of us who are trying to do this work and add to it. There's a lot of groundwork that needs to happen. So making space for also thinking about and putting attention towards, Antillean and indigenities, I think would be, much needed, especially because it's like a, still gestating area of the field. That's what I was gonna add.
Thank you. I think that is a great point, and everyone made wonderful points, but I'm thinking, Christina, specifically this earlier in the town hall, we were talking about a liaison with the Centro and PRSA. And so someone who has this kind of vision might be great. So maybe we'll be in touch about these positions, institutionally speaking, not necessarily just within, the established physical institutions, but just like PRSA as an institution as well. I also want to say thank you all for keeping the chat so active and for shouting out where you're coming from and just seeing all of the props that you're giving to all of the speakers. Thank you to all the speakers. I have so many notes. I feel like this is a manifesto for the future of PRSA. Sorry about that. And so, yeah, I thank everyone for coming, and know that there were a few questions that were quite specific to the speakers. So I'm sure that they wouldn't mind if you wrote to them directly and asked. But once again, thank you all so much for participating here, to the speakers and to everyone who watched, and stay tuned for the next year and our next year's conference, which will hopefully be in person. So check out the social media. We will be recording and posting this up on the website, and just drop us a line if you'd like to see more of this. So thanks again. I'll stop recording now. Bye-bye.